eventually. Here we go. Good day, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 10, which is going to be about the Anglo-German naval race roughly between 1900 and 1914. To give people a chance to get in here, as always, I am going to start us off with a tune.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wild. Your new God's sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love and heed and folly, bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall weigh your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come thou to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden,
And that was, of course, the excellent Chris Gard. Do go and check out his YouTube channel if you like good music. He is one of us, so he's a good guy on the right of the political spectrum. Welcome to my guests this evening, Mitch Hitman and Aaron Hook. We are going to be talking about the Anglo-German naval race, which goes roughly from 1900 to 1914, but actually around that era. A subject that's very close to my own heart because I really like naval history, and it had a big influence on Britain joining World War I, which in my humble opinion was the original sin of Britain and the Empire, was joining World War I in 1914, and then on top of that, against all British military tradition, raising a mass army, which is something Britain just did not do. It relied on the Royal Navy and a small expeditionary army. And if you look at the ills of Britain and indeed of the world, you could probably trace a great many of them to World War I, if you ask me. The Anglo-German naval race, which was started entirely deliberately by the Germans, was the main reason that Britain went from being neutral about Germany to being an enemy of Germany. I don't know whether any of my guests have anything they'd like to say about this in terms of setting the stage. So, like Anglo-German relations in the 1890s, for example.
I can speak about that for a bit. Pretty much from the British attitude starting from the 1860s is they can see Germany's unification is coming and they aren't necessarily opposed to it. So Gladstone's government is in power when the Franco-Prussian War takes place, and they don't regard it necessary for Britain to intervene in that war on either side. And from unification up until pretty much the beginning of the 20th century, the British are trying to come to an accommodation with the Germans. And this really sort of kicks off in the 1890s after the Unionist government led by Lord Salisbury comes to power. And he, and particularly via Joseph Chamberlain, are attempting to come to an actual alliance with the Germans. They do it. There's two attempts involving Chamberlain, one in the late 1890s, one in about 1901 during the early years of the end of Salisbury's government, beginning of Balfour's government, and both of them failed as the Germans aren't willing to form an alliance. They don't see it necessarily in their interest to, mainly because, partly it's because the Germans don't necessarily see the point, because Britain only has a navy, and obviously Germany being the famous saying, this is Prussia was an army with a country attached, and so they regard the fact that the British have a small army as making them not necessarily the best of allies. And at the same time, we've also got people around Tirpitz who want to build a navy, and they see an alliance with Britain as undermining the growth of the German navy. And so it's very much that's sort of the context when you come to the Edwardian era, that the British have attempted to come to terms to form an actual alliance with the Germans, and it has failed very much from the German side.
Yeah, don't disagree with any of that, Aaron. Basically, the Royal Navy was essential to Britain and the Empire. Because the Empire was scattered all around the world, the only way that Britain could maintain its security was via the Royal Navy. And if Britain didn't have the largest navy in the world, then the Empire would, in fairly short order, cease to exist, pretty much. The Royal Navy was the guarantor of the Empire. And of course, the Empire was the root, or maybe not the root, but it was one of the bases of British power. The third of the world was British, basically, in 1900. Again, does anyone have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's in the case of, let's say, the Germans. I mean, they're not known for having naval power really because they've always, they're hemmed in between the French and the Russians. Plus, on the British Empire, they didn't really have many naval outposts, even when they were setting out of the colonial empire. For example, you got Tsingtao in China, you've got northern Papua New Guinea, Namibia, and is it Togo or Benin or one of those?
Yes, in West Africa.
Yeah, the problem was, like the Germans had no hope of holding on to such holdings. So, in the grand scheme of things, yeah, we can look at this with a sense of just face palming, looking at the Germans, going, what were they thinking? Because there wasn't a cat's chance in hell that they could ever outmatch the Royal Navy, even if they were to win one battle against a home fleet in the North Sea. It's still a position of, well, we outbuild them. We've got more of a naval tradition. The Germans,
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that British shipbuilders at this time in the late 1890s and the early 1900s, British shipbuilders were the best and most efficient in the world, and we had a hell of a lot of them. There was no other nation that could build warships as quickly and as many as the British could. The picture I've got on the screen at the moment is Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, I believe, and the battleship in the middle is HMS Majestic, which was the first of a class of 13 battleships. That's the largest battleship class that anyone has ever built. No country could even think of building a, and that includes, by the way, America as well as Germany. Nobody at that time could think of building a class of 13 battleships. It was just too many, for other nations. And at the time that this picture is, which is supposed to be 1897, when Majestic was a couple of years old, Britain had, roughly speaking, 50 battleships, which was about 25 more than anybody else had. Britain ran a thing called the two-power standard, which meant that the Royal Navy had to be larger than the next two navies combined. Duerty fan in the chat, I'm going to come on to Dreadnoughts in a minute. Britain had a much larger navy than any other two navies, because in 1897, the largest navies would have been probably France and Russia. And the Royal Navy was kept stronger than both of those navies combined. Aaron, Mitch, Hitman, anybody got anything to continue on?
Yeah, just to add a bit more to the point about the sort of importance of the Royal Navy to Britain. And in addition to being the thing that sort of was the sinews that kept the British Empire together, more fundamentally to that, the Royal Navy is important to Britain's defence itself. It is the first and last line of defence of Britain.
Yeah, and also, of course, worth remembering that most of the world's merchant ships, at the time we're talking around, most of the world's merchant ships were British flagged.
Yeah.
Like, there were more British merchant ships than all the other countries put together.
Yeah, and so it was the importance of having a big navy, even if you take the empire out of the equation, is still you can't sort of emphasize that. It is sort of any attempt to build a bigger navy than Britain is, from British strategic defence, the British strategic defence point of view, is a existential threat to Britain.
Yes, and to the empire. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. There was nothing else you could do that would be worse for Britain than trying to build a navy to rival the Royal Navy.
Yeah,
Britain. That was the only thing that was always going to make you an enemy of Britain, because Britain's survival depended on the Royal Navy. I mean, don't forget, Britain used to import, what still does, but Britain imports a lot of food, etc. Now, I've had discussions with people on this channel before as to whether or not Britain could be self-sufficient in food, but the fact is we weren't.
Yeah.
And as a result, we had to import food. And if you could cut off the sea lanes coming into Britain, which is, of course, an island nation, you could destroy the country. It's as simple as that, really.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Mitch is saying, did we create our empire absent-mindedly? I don't think we did it all deliberately. You know, I don't think there was a master plan, Mitch, in that sense. But obviously, there was more purpose to it than is sometimes put about these days. And yes, it's quite true that all the major strategic points in the world were run by the Royal Navy. So to give you a really good example, most people have heard of the Great White Fleet, the American fleet that went around the world in, when was it, 1899, 1900, around that era. That was only able to do that because the Royal Navy let them do it, basically, because the Americans didn't have coaling bases and stuff. And had the Royal Navy not wanted them to do that, they wouldn't have been able to go very far from their bases. So, and that was equally true for one of the difficulties the Russians had. Someone earlier asked about the Russo-Japanese War, which again we'll come on to in a minute. But one of the difficulties the Russians had was actually coaling their fleet to get to Japan. Because
I was going to say
all the coaling places. Sorry, Mitch, carry on, mate.
I was going to say just because he was asking how bad the defeat was, and the thing was Kolchak basically reformed the fleet so that when the Baltic Sea Fleet fights the Germans and the Black Sea Fleet fighting the Ottomans, they actually performed quite well. Now, they were never going to be challenged towards really in the grand scheme of things because, well, when you look at Russia's geography, their fleet are hemmed in. You have the Baltic Sea, well, that's hemmed in by Denmark and Sweden patrolling away. And you've got the Kiel Canal for battle for the Germans. Black Sea, well, battle at the mercy of the Ottomans. And you've got the Pacific, well, the Pacific fleet on the Russian side doesn't really have to do much, aside from perhaps join the Japanese in taking Tsingtao and a push. Other than that, you know, like the Russians were not a threat towards us in terms of naval expansion because their geography just too awkward.
And to some degree, Mitch, the Germans, of course, I've got a map that I'm going to put up in a bit. The Germans were basically confined to the Baltic and a very small bit of the North Sea coast. And in between the German fleet and the rest of the world sits the British Isles, basically, which is kind of difficult if you want to get out into the Atlantic and then into the other oceans around the world, as the Germans would find in both world wars. It was like if you could get an occasional ship out, but only an occasional ship, and then it had to get home again afterwards, which was quite difficult.
Yeah, because this is one thing that was a massive red flag to us, was when we built up Wilhelmshaven, or we would say Williamsport in English. The thing was, before that, because the Germans did have a naval academy based in Kiel, but that was on the Baltic Sea coastline, and yeah, at that point, you know, the Germans were only really thinking of their navy as like coastal defence and not really much money to be invested because they've got the army. Because of course, when you look at Germany's geography, naturally you're going to think, well, it's like the ancient Romans. They didn't have to invest massively into a navy up until the First Punic War because of their geography. You know, they were on a land-based power. Likewise, the Germans, being a land-based power, of course, even up until Albert von Tirpitz takes the helm in the German Navy, everyone was just like, oh, well, the Navy is just to be kept to basically just coastal defence. You know, they don't go too far, they don't go out their way to launch a battle, and they don't go out and sally against anyone like the Royal Navy. I mean, the German Navy didn't get battered in the Franco-Prussian War because the French Navy was poorly organised under Napoleon III.
Yeah. The French had a much bigger navy than Prussia did in 1870. But this chap who I put on the screen is Admiral Tirpitz, the guy with the very fine forked beard. And in 1897 or 1898, he came up with a plan that he put to the Kaiser, who he was a friend of, that the Germans would start to build a great fleet. Now, his idea was not that this fleet, that's at this stage in 1897, his idea was not that the Germans would build a fleet that could beat the Royal Navy. That was not what he thought. But what he thought was, if Germany had a big enough fleet, then Britain would want to negotiate and become friends with the Germans. Yes, I've watched Fall of Eagles, Duke Valentino. Yes, I've seen it. I've also seen Apostolic Majesty's excellent stream on Fall of Eagles. Anyway, Tirpitz decided that he would build this fleet, and that because Germany would have a big fleet, Britain would become friendly with Germany and give them concessions and all the things that didn't happen, and that were the actual opposite of what was always going to happen if Germany built a big fleet. As I said in my introduction, this was the one thing you could do that would guarantee to make Britain your enemy. And Tirpitz, who in some respects obviously was an intelligent bloke, Tirpitz didn't see this at all for some very strange reason. I don't know how intelligent people like Tirpitz didn't see it. I get why the Kaiser didn't, because the Kaiser wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed in many respects. And of course, the way Tirpitz sold the Kaiser on the fleet was this was going to be the Kaiser's own personal vanity project, because the Kaiser had a lot more influence over the German Navy than he ever did over the German army, which was basically run by the German General Staff, the famous German General Staff. But it's been aptly described, I think, by Winston Churchill. I don't often agree with Winston Churchill, but he described the German fleet as a luxury fleet. And of course, he was entirely correct, because Germany didn't need a great big fleet. They had the world's largest and most powerful army. They did not need a big navy in addition to that. And in fact, all the Navy was going to do was to take money away from the German army, basically. Anybody else? Hitman or anybody?
Most of what I've got to say in contribution is more about the sort of oil element when it comes to the conversion of the Royal Navy. So I guess we'll get
onto that in a sorry, Hitman, we'll get onto that in a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of warships and things in a minute. But anyway, this is Tirpitz, who basically was the architect of this, and as a result was the architect of Britain becoming an enemy of Germany, but basically the German high seas fleet and the policy of building it was what drove Britain into the arms of the French and the Russians, with the Ententes, and with all the vileness that came with that, i.e. the Great War. Because if Britain had not been basically an ally of France and Russia against Germany, the First World War probably would have just been a large European war rather than a world war, because it was Britain being a member of, Britain being part of the Entente powers, which turned it into a world war, and of course also lost Germany all her colonies. Had Germany only been fighting France and Russia, she would probably not have lost all her colonies. It was the fact that she fought Britain, and that Britain could move troops all around the world quite easily and just take them one by one.
Yeah,
I think.
Carry on, Hitman.
Go ahead.
No, you carry on. Whoever was speaking.
Ultimately, Togoland and Cameroon in West Africa were quite isolated, so the French probably could have overwhelmed them. But East Africa and Southwest Africa probably would have held out.
Yeah, and also the French would probably not have been strong enough to have captured Tsingtao in China. Not in that part of the world. The French Navy was not particularly powerful. And of course, it was worse for the Germans because by 1904, Britain had an alliance with Japan. And Japan, for her own reasons, wanted to get rid of any German colonies close to her, which they did in pretty short order. So yeah, basically, Tirpitz's policy was crazy. I still don't understand how intelligent Germans thought this was going to work, because you have to understand Germany could not, under any circumstances, outbuild Britain in terms of more ships. She just couldn't. She didn't have enough dockyards. They weren't efficient enough, and there were nowhere near enough of them. Like Britain could build battleships, which are in those days were the biggest ship. Britain could build battleships in something like 25 yards in 1900. No one else could do that.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder what the German Foreign Office was telling the Kaiser, because they would have known that the British, in say 1900, at that point, throughout the period from when Tirpitz put his plan to the Kaiser right through to when the Entente Cordiale comes into place in 1904, the British had faced down the French at the shoulder in 1898, and then had formed an alliance with the Japanese, and that put the British at odds fundamentally with the Franco-Russian alliance. And so, as you say, Duke, if this naval race hadn't taken place, the British would not have gotten involved in World War I, because there wouldn't have been a need to form any alliance with either the French or the Russians.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the ships, and the ship in the picture that's on the screen at the moment is HMS Majestic. Now, she was what was called a pre-dreadnought battleship, although some naval historians prefer to refer to them as Royal Sovereign class battleships, because the Royal Sovereign class, which was built in Britain in the late 1880s, kind of set the pattern for most battleships up until 1904. And the thing about these ships is they had there were a few variations, but for the most part, most of these so-called pre-dreadnought battleships or Royal Sovereign type battleships had two main turrets with two guns in, which were normally about 12-inch caliber. And they had about roughly a dozen 6-inch or sometimes slightly bigger secondary guns, usually about 6 a side. Now, as I say, there were variations on that, but that was pretty much the standard pre-dreadnought battleship. And they had reciprocating engines that would give them a top speed of about 18 knots, roughly. And a knot is 1.1 miles an hour for anyone who's interested in such things. Now, as I say, in 1900, Britain had about 50 of these things, depending how you count them, which was about 20 odd or 20 or 25 more than anyone else had. Yeah, went along quite well. Well, Britain had her own big-time admiral at this stage, and this was Jackie Fisher, who I have a picture of. Put up Jackie Fisher. Here we go. And this is Admiral Jackie Fisher, who became the first Sea Lord in the early 1900s. And quite a few navies had been working, including the British, of course, had been working on producing a revolutionary design of battleship, which instead of having 4 main guns, would have an armament which was nearly all main guns, so 8 or 10 or whatever. Jackie Fisher was an enthusiast for this idea, and he pushed through HMS Dreadnought. And HMS Dreadnought is an excellent example of how good the British shipyards were. She was a revolutionary battleship. She was larger than any battleship before her. She had more big guns than any battleship before her. Instead of reciprocating engines, she had turbine engines, which instead of 18 knots, she could do over 21 knots. So she was an entirely revolutionary ship. And the British shipyards were so good, from the time they laid her keel to her launch was less than a year. It took less than 12 months. So let's have a look at HMS Dreadnought.
It's also important to remember that Jackie Fisher was also one of the biggest advocates for converting the Royal Navy from coal to oil as its fuel.
Yep, he was. He was hitman, and we'll come on to that shortly. Now, this is HMS Dreadnought. She had 10 12-inch guns, and she didn't have any secondary guns at all. Now, that wouldn't last. She had only 12-pounders apart from her 12-inch guns, and that wouldn't last because torpedo boat destroyers, which is how we get the term destroyer, became more powerful, and you eventually needed to have 4 and then 6-inch guns to destroy those things, or at least keep them away from your battleships. So eventually dreadnoughts would have secondary guns, but the main thing about them was they had turbine engines, so they could do at least 21 knots. And they had somewhere between 6 and I think some of them had as many as 14 large guns, like 12-inch or more. And when Dreadnought was produced, and as I said, she was built in great secrecy and very quickly. She made every other battleship in the world obsolescent because she was at least twice as powerful as any pre-Dreadnought battleship. In World War I, there were occasions where pre-Dreadnoughts fought Dreadnoughts, and it actually turned out that 2 or 3 pre-Dreadnoughts could actually fight a Dreadnought, but you needed 2 or 3 of them to do it. Now, some people pointed out that from Britain's point of view, in some respects, the building of the Dreadnought was a mistake, because Britain had 50 pre-Dreadnoughts, but when we built Dreadnought, we had 1, although we were also starting to build some more, of course. And it put everyone back on a level playing field again. But it didn't really matter because, again, the British shipyards were so efficient and there were so many of them that Britain could build these things much more quickly, as we'll see. This is why the Anglo-German naval race was pretty pointless from the Germans' point of view. And by about 1912, the Germans had realized this, that they couldn't possibly outbuild the Royal Navy. It just couldn't be done.
Yeah, it's also the Liberal government in 1906, when they got voted in, they hated the idea of building more dreadnoughts and just thought it was a waste of money. But then it was because Reginald McKenna literally going into a cabinet meeting in the end of 1908 saying, instead of building 2 dreadnoughts as originally planned, we have to triple it to 6 per year. So that by 1912 we have an additional 18 dreadnoughts altogether, and that if this was not satisfied, then all the senior officers of the Royal Navy would all quit, which of course that would be a massive scandal for the Liberal Party government.
Oh yeah, it would have brought the government down, Mitch, for sure, because the idea of all the British senior admirals resigning, which they would have, and you got to understand that in Britain there was a thing called the Navy League. Like, the Royal Navy was extremely popular in the early 20th century. It was far more than it is today. People today don't care that there's hardly any Royal Navy left in 2025. But in 1900 and 1910, the Royal Navy was vastly popular in Britain, and people did really care about it. Because everyone realised it was the guarantor of Britain's security as an island nation, and it was also the guarantor of the security of the British Empire. Without it, there would be no British Empire, and Britain as an island would starve, basically.
Yeah, it's also
So-
worth noting. The other Germans also had their own.
Oh, we've lost Mitch.
Hang on. Let me put him back on the screen. There you go, Mitch.
I was going to say, like, the Germans had their own naval league, and it was a big chunk of it was basically students who were just like, they grew up under Kaiser Wilhelm, and basically like, they had like a strong Anglophobic, I suppose you could say, streak about them. So like there was that, and then also and also on the point of because the German ambassador at the time, like, because when Reginald McKenna goes in and says we need to build more dreadnoughts, at the same time you have the German ambassador to Britain, Paul Wolf Metternich. He doesn't get the full picture from Tirpitz and the Kaiser and what is being done. So there are often times where Lord Grey and Reginald McKenna are asking, okay, are you is the German Navy pre-ordering material and laying off keels before you even started building ships? Because if that was so, then it might say that the German Navy's got really big plans. Metternich was left in the blank a bit of this, so he just denied it. But then, of course, we find out anyway this is what's happening. Now, to be fair, they're doing it because of cost measures. Because if they stockpiled equipment and whatnot before they would start to build ships, then it's cheaper when actually building the ships. But this all looks suspect to us. And the fact that the German ambassador was seemingly lying to us, well, he wasn't. He was just about he was left in the dark by Turkey.
Yes,
And
that's true.
yeah, and the thing was, it just created a lot of distrust that the Germans did not help, because it'd often be a situation where Tirpitz would actually explain, but by this time Metternich, in terms of credibility, was scorched. So there wasn't really much of a bridge between ourselves and the Germans.
No, there was a total misunderstanding, Mitch. The Kaiser, because he wasn't the brightest tool in the shed, did a lot of harm to Anglo-German relations with things like the Kruger telegram, which we've spoken about before on streams. When Kruger defeated the botched Jameson raid in 1896, the Kaiser sent him a telegram congratulating him and saying, "Oh, it's great that you were able to defeat the dastardly British without asking help from your friends." And of course, Britain at that stage, in the late 1890s, the Germans couldn't have helped the Boer republics even if they wanted to, because the then tiny German fleet would have just been sunk if it had tried to send help to South Africa. So, and of course, Tirpitz used this as part of his reason for saying, "Oh, well, we've got to build up the navy." But the thing was, you see, they could build up their navy, but even if I think Germany in 1897 had about 6 pre-dreadnought battleships, and Britain had 50. So Tirpitz could build 12 or 15 more dreadnoughts, and it wouldn't make any difference. The Royal Navy would still just overwhelm them. This is why the German policy makes no sense. Yeah, in order for the German policy to work, you actually have to be able to build more ships than Britain can, and Germany couldn't. People will talk in general terms about, German industry was overtaking Britain in the 1900s, and yes, it was in some respects, but the respect in which it wasn't and wasn't able to was shipbuilding. Britain had a much bigger coast. Britain had vast amounts of naval and maritime infrastructure, like ports, dockyards, all this kind of stuff that you need for that stuff. And it wasn't possible for the Germans, even if they'd have wanted to do so, they couldn't build more dockyards than Britain had. They didn't have the coastline to do it, for one thing, because you can only put dockyards in certain places, And the Germany just didn't have the coastline to do this. And then you've got to spend absolutely, in modern money, you would be spending billions and billions and billions to build facilities. And then you've got to have all the skilled workers and what have you. You know, the shipyard workers are all skilled guys for the most part. And you've got to have that, which takes ages and ages and ages to train people for. Yeah. And as I said, when Britain built the Dreadnought, the ship in the picture on the screen at the moment, from the time we laid her keel to the time she was launched was less than a year. That was how efficient the British dockyards were. And Germany couldn't hope to compete with that.
Yeah, I was going to say, but the Germans kind of had a case of strategic feedback loop, plus also just some cost fallacy towards like the latter end of the 1900s. Because on one hand, you have the Germans saying, we want naval supremacy in the North Sea to make sure they don't get starved to death in the event of a war. Well, naval supremacy, who are the main ones owning the North Sea? It's not the French, it's us.
Yes.
So, and B, well, you've also got to deal with, like, you have massive industrial concerns, like Krupp, steel, who, because they lost out on their foreign markets, especially Russia, due to the French, they've got a vested interest in making just building up loads of naval guns. Like, you'd often have, like, Krupp, for example, there was rumours that they were stockpiling massive warehouse, like 12-inch gun barrels and whatnot. And like,
this is Mitch. This is another thing, and this will bring us on to the thing I know Hitman wants to talk about, which is oil fire. One of the advantages the Royal Navy had over the Germans was the very high quality of some of the British coal. The coal in Britain, especially in Wales, is the cleanest burning and best coal in the world, frankly. And all of the best Welsh coal was in the early 20th century was reserved for the Royal Navy. Because if you've got cleaner burning coal, it actually makes your ship slightly faster, and it means their boilers don't get so dirty. It's just better to have good coal. And Germany didn't have good coal. Germany had pretty shitty coal, to be honest. And as a result, their ships, when they were steaming for a long time, would get slower and slower. And when they got back in the port, they had to spend ages cleaning their boilers and furnaces and all the rest of it, which didn't happen with Royal Navy ships. When Germany started the Dreadnought race, they generally used 11-inch guns on German battleships. And the first German Dreadnoughts also used 11-inch guns. And indeed, the first class of German Dreadnoughts were not actually turbine powered, because the German turbines were not advanced enough at this stage to use. So they still had reciprocating engines, as indeed did the first American Dreadnoughts with all big guns. So the Brits had this advantage in coal, and it didn't take Britain very long before she started building what were called super dreadnoughts. So a couple of classes after Dreadnought, we started building ships with not 12-inch guns, but with 13.5-inch guns. And the German response to this was to build ships with 12-inch guns, because they couldn't build anything any bigger. And the British then went on and started building ships with 15-inch guns. And it was only, I think, in 1917 that the Germans got their first two ships with 15-inch guns. So at the Battle of Jutland, which was the great clash of dreadnoughts in 1916, the German high seas fleet was equipped with 11 and 12-inch guns, whereas the British Grand Fleet had 15-inch guns, 14-inch guns, 13.5-inch guns, and the smallest guns we have were 12 inches. And in fact, the British Grand Fleet was so large at this stage that HMS Dreadnought herself in the picture didn't even take part in the Battle of Jutland, because she was considered a bit obsolescent, and instead was in charge of the Channel Fleet, was the flagship of the Channel Fleet, which was pre-Dreadnoughts, because Britain, of course, still had all these pre-Dreadnought battleships, many of which fought in the Mediterranean and in the Gallipoli campaign, etc. But before we get on to the other thing that Britain did, which was oil, I'd just like to ask Aaron or anybody else if you'd like to say a bit more about the politics of this era in terms of Anglo-German relations and what have you.
Yeah, just to add what you said, Duke, about the Kaiser sort of buggering things up. He does an interview with the Daily Telegraph in, I think it was a few years after the telegram to Kruger, where he sits down and he sort of gives his views, and he makes sort of all sorts of ridiculous things about how he is pro-British and how politicians in Germany are the problem and how politicians in Britain are the problem. And he single-handedly sort of undermines the goodwill that exists in Britain at that point. And I think around that point, Chamberlain is on his second attempt to come to some kind of alliance or closer relations with the Germans, and it creates, as I say, bad will in both countries, both towards each other, but also towards the Kaiser himself within Germany. It brings him into even more disrepute than he has been. Because within Germany, the Kruger telegram was regarded among German foreign policy circles as a bad thing as well. So you have at that point, you have two things going on in Germany. You've got the Kaiser making his pronouncements, and you've got the German Foreign Office trying to do diplomacy itself, and so that's causing even more sort of trouble between Britain and Germany. And
I've always thought, Aaron, that I think it was the Kaiser who said that an Anglo-German alliance would have meant that nobody could do anything in the world, because the Germans had the largest and most powerful army in the world, and of course the British had the largest and most powerful navy. And I think there's a great deal of truth in that, actually.
Yeah, very much. So that was sort of the opinion of Joseph Chamberlain. That's why he was attempting to come to an accommodation, at the very least, an accommodation with the Germans, because he thought that the Anglo-German alliance would be sort of the axis on which the world could be run. And he was deeply unhappy at the fact that he was unable to get an alliance between the two countries, or even a close accommodation during the two attempts he made to get that with the Germans.
Well, I mean, the other thing, of course, is that, I mean, this is going to take us a little bit off a tangent, but I think it's worth exploring a little bit. An Anglo-German alliance would have probably meant no World War I, because France would not have been able, really, to fight the Germans in the face of the Royal Navy blockading all their ports.
Oh yeah, in fact, you wouldn't even need the Royal Navy to take part in such a war. The fact that the Royal Navy would give the Germans the right to operate freely within the Channel itself.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, but what I'm saying here, Aaron, is you have to, for this to be impossible, the Germans would have had to have restricted their fleet. Like, if the Germans had said, okay, we're going to build, I don't know, let's say 20 pre-Dreadnoughts, Britain would have lived with that, because we had 50. We wouldn't really have cared. And 20 pre-Dreadnoughts would have been more than enough for the Germans to have defeated the French Navy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you could have had Britain just being an armed neutral, and it would have stuffed the French. And the French and Russians would have looked at that situation, I suspect, and have said, well, it's not worth us getting in a war with the Germans, basically. Yeah.
And it also, just since we've gone on this tangent, we should also mention the Anglo-Japanese alliance again, because if you in that scenario, you've obviously got the French looking at the British, but also the Russians are going to be looking at a two-front war, or actually probably a three-front war, given the Ottomans, themselves, with the Japanese fighting in the Far East. And that would have been something that the Russians wouldn't have been particularly pleased about.
Yeah, and I mean, bear in mind, of course, Britain's already got its alliance with Japan, and when the Russian-Japanese War broke out, the Russians were well aware that Britain was not their pal. Now, it was a good treaty because it didn't require Japan or Britain to get involved in a war that only involved one other power. It had to involve at least two powers to activate it, if you see what I mean. So had another nation also declared war against Japan, then Britain would have been on their side, which of course meant in naval terms Japan couldn't lose, basically.
Yeah. And we should point out that you mentioned earlier about the Russian fleets going from the Cold War to the Far East during the Russo-Japanese War. In the process of them doing that, they nearly brought Britain into the war by shelling the fishing fleet in the North Sea.
They did. So, they shelled a British trawler, a group of British trawlers, and their gunnery was so terrible they didn't hit anything. Which was fortunate because the British squadron then shadowed them all the way through the Bay of Biscay, etc. So, I don't think they would have done very well if it had come to a fight. They were actually a lot better by the time they got to the Sea of Japan and the disastrous Battle of Tsushima. The Russians were actually better by that stage because their admiral had spent the voyage trying to train them to be better at gunnery and stuff. I don't know if you've got anything to say on that, Mitch, because I know you're quite into your Russian history. Perhaps Mitch is not there at the moment. Also, I noticed, Mitch, you got no avatar this week. Not like you. Okay, so as I said, Britain started building super dreadnoughts with much bigger guns, 13.5-inch guns instead of 12-inch guns, and then eventually 15-inch guns as well. And one of the other things we did was we started to switch to oil firing our ships. Hang on, Mitch is back, and I'm going to ask him if he's... Mitch, did you have anything you wanted to say about the Russian Second Pacific Squadron getting better as it went around towards Japan?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name.
Roshkovensky, I think, was the admiral, wasn't it?
Yeah, because there was like one of the Russian fleet admiral, Stepan Makov, who was actually quite competent, but he got killed off early on in the war.
He was actually in Port Arthur, wasn't he, in charge of the Russian ships there?
Yeah, but he got killed off early on, so had he commanded, for example, Russian fleet at Tsushima, perhaps things would have gone a different way. And this is why Kolchak was so important for the Russian Navy after between Tsushima and First World War, because he brings in reforms to gunnery and whatnot. That means the Russian fleet becomes a lot better. For example, if you watch the 2008 film Admiral, it kind of shows it's kind of sort of a snapshot of how effective Kolchak was at making the Russian Navy a lot better dealing with. So, the Russian Navy really wasn't up to par heading for Tsushima. Yeah, they were improving along the way, especially once they crossed, for example, the Suez Canal and so on. But the Japanese were it was their time to shine, I suppose. As for the other thing was, as for politics, because the thing was, you have Tirpitz. He was able to read the Kaiser pretty well. Like he knew about he knew how to read him. He knew how to activate all his buttons, and he just said, "Well, if you give me money, I'll create it." Because of course, the thing was, so there wasn't an air force back then, and the German army was able to push an aristocrat force, so they had their own power. They had their own power base within Parliament, or the Reichstag, as the Germans call it. They couldn't be bullied by the Kaiser in that way, whereas the Navy was much more the Kaiser plaything. Anything he said went.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The German army was overwhelmingly controlled by the German general staff, and the Kaiser had little influence on that, really. I mean, he liked to dress up in uniforms and go to the maneuvers, but he had no he had no real control over the German army, whereas the Navy was much more his vanity project and his plaything, you know.
Yeah.
Duke
So
Valentino keeps telling us about John Holland and the submarine. Yes, John Holland did invent the first modern practical submarine. He didn't invent the first submarine or even the third or fourth submarine, but he invented the first modern practical one. Yes, he did. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so the other thing that, oh, by the way, if you want to see a British pre-Dreadnought battleship, you have to go to Japan. If you go to Japan today, you can go and see the Japanese flagship at the Battle of Tsushima, the Mikasa, and she was actually built in Britain, and she's the only surviving British battleship if you don't count like older ships like HMS Warrior.
yeah, because
But yeah, she was the Mikasa, which you can go and see in Japan. She's a museum ship, and an excellent one, by the way. Is the only surviving British battleship in the world. So do go and check that out if you're ever in Japan.
yeah, because the other thing I wanted to mention was so Tirpitz. One thing the German Navy had a problem with was they just had like various bureaucratic offices that were responsible for different aspects of the Navy. Like, for example, you'd have what was called the Oberkommando, or High Command. They'd be the ones issuing orders to the admirals over what to do. So, for example, the orders for the German fleet in Kiel to sally out again to meet the Royal Navy in 1918, that would be by the Oberkommando. Then there was the RMT, or Reichsmarine-Amt. They'd be the ones in charge of like, building the ships on the logistical side of the Navy. And then you have what was called the Naval Cabinet. They'd be the ones telling the Kaiser, and they'd be directly subordinate to the Kaiser, telling him what's going on with the Navy, like how many ships have been built, what's going on. But like the thing was, there was never any sense of unity of purpose. There was never really any great communication. So for the 1890s and early 1900s, you just had a great deal of just bureaucratic shuffling every 5 minutes within the German Navy.
Yep, absolutely true. I'll just say to people, guys, if you want to ask questions and what have you, if you look at the top of the chat, there is a pinned entropy link, and you can ask questions there, and anything you ask will get answered towards the end of the stream. And also, of course, if you just want to support the channel, that's where you could make a donation. Anyway, to move us on a little bit, because we've been going for an hour now. One of the things the Royal Navy did, as well as building bigger super dreadnoughts with 13.5-inch and then eventually 15-inch guns, was Britain switched from coal to oil fire. Now, oil, it was more efficient, so it tended to make ships a little bit faster. It also made the sailors very happy, because coaling ship was one of the worst jobs on a 19th and early 20th century ship. You got filthy doing it, because you had to take sacks and sacks of coal into the ship and then down into the coal bunkers. And that was all done by hand. So one of the things the Royal Navy did, which again was much more difficult for the Germans, as Hitman is going to explain for us, I hope, just now, is we switched to oil firing. And of course, we were able to do that in large part because of the British Empire. Hitman, would you like to talk about this stuff a bit?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, so Jackie Fisher coming in 1904 as the first Sea Lord is one of the. It's a bit of a struggle, because there's lots of sort of conservative types within the Royal Navy who don't want to switch away from coal. So the biggest advocates are obviously Jackie Fisher's. Him coming as first Sea Lord is a step in that direction, but also it's around this time. Obviously, you had the development of the oil industry, and it's around this time in the 1890s, in 1897, you have the creation of the Shell Transport and Trading Company by the brothers Marcus Samuel and Samuel Samuel. And Marcus Samuel is also, again, a very big advocate for the conversion of the Royal Navy. And so, however, the problem is that Shell is only a transport company. So it has tankers which ships oil around, but they don't actually extract or exploit oil. And what ends up happening is Shell ends up becoming very dependent on the Dutch oil company, Royal Dutch. And in 1907, the two merged to become Royal Dutch Shell, as it would become, as it's best known as. And so, because at this time, for those who don't know, with the oil industry, there's only really two giants. There's Standard Oil in America, though they would be trust-busted a few years later after this and broken up. But then you've got Royal Dutch Shell. And so Jackie Fisher, if he wants to convert the Royal Navy to oil, he wants to secure British-controlled source. And the problem is, because with Royal Dutch Shell, the Dutch half, the Royal Dutch, is the dominant company. It has a 60% stake in the merger. And because the Dutch have got quite strong relations with the Germans, he doesn't feel they can be adequately relied upon to, only serve the British interest, if that makes sense. And so there's a hunt to try and find an alternate source. And who comes to save the day but a certain businessman called William Knox Darcy. So Knox Darcy, he was a solicitor in Australia who had a background in the gold mining industry. And he becomes interested in oil in about 1901. And he starts to exploit for oil in Iran. And so in 1901, he's able to get a concession where, in exchange for receiving £20,000 in cash and £20,000 of shares and a 16% stake in any profits, Darcy's granted an oil concession. However, this does take 8 years to actually find any solid strike. And so he almost goes bankrupt a couple of times trying to do this. So it isn't until 1908 that the first proper strike is found in Masjid-i-Suleiman in Khuzestan, which is in southwestern Iran. And what's important is that while this is going on, Knox Darcy is trying to get aid because there's a danger of him going bankrupt because this venture is proving to be very expensive. And so there's something very interesting here where, because the idea of converting the Royal Navy to oil was seen as so important, a lot of businessmen get together in something that's called a Syndicate of Patriots, and this is led by a Lord Strathcona, and so they bail out Darcy to get the venture going, and to also help, they get another British oil company that's already been established called Burma Oil, so they largely are working out of Burma and India, and so they send some of their experts over to help Knox Darcy. And so when oil is struck in 1908, what they do is they create a new company called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, headed by Knox Darcy as a subsidiary of Burma Oil. And then also around this time, 1907, you have the Anglo-Russian Entente over Iran, where they partition the country into spheres of influence, and the Russians recognise the British sphere of influence in the south, which is important because the south is where Khuzestan is and where most of the oil is. And it also means and ultimately means that area is British and no other power can come in. The Russians can't encroach because the British are concerned, because the Russians already 100 years before ripped away Azerbaijan and the Caucasus provinces from Iran, which obviously around Baku, the Russians have quite a large oil operation going, so the British didn't really want the Russians expanding that even further. So now they've got their own oil production in the region. So going back to Marcus Samuel, so Darcy meets Jackie Fisher earlier in 1903, and with the establishment of Anglo-Persian, Fisher becomes a lot more interested in potentially getting Anglo-Persian to be the company that they rely on. And so obviously he quits as First Sea Lord in 1910, and but what he's able to do is he establishes a friendship with Winston Churchill, who obviously comes in as the First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911. And it's largely thanks to Churchill, because what happens is, though they've got the business set up in Persia, Anglo-Persian still isn't doing great. And so, concerned that Royal Dutch Shell might move in and take over Anglo-Persian, what Churchill does is that he organises for the government to come and acquire a majority stakeholder in Anglo-Persian, acquiring a 51%, meaning the government effectively owns the company. And so in exchange for essentially bailing out Anglo-Persian now has to provide the Royal Navy with a discounted price for oil, and has to give the Navy first refusal for any of its oil demands. And there's a very famous quote I actually want to read from Churchill about this decision. So here we go. So to build any large additional number of oil-burning ships meant basing our naval supremacy upon oil, but oil was not found in appreciable quantities in our islands. If we required it, we must carry it by sea in peace or war from distant countries. We had, on the other hand, the finest supply of the best steam coal in the world, safe in our mines under our own land. To commit the Navy irrevocably to oil was indeed to take arms against the sea of troubles. Yet if the difficulties and risks could be surmounted, we should be able to raise the whole power and efficiency of the Navy to a definitely higher level. Better ships, better crews, higher economies, more intense forms of war power. In a word, mastery itself was the prize of the venture. And so ultimately, Churchill knew he was sort of doing a bit of a gamble when he committed itself to oil, believing, yes, the Navy will be stronger, but obviously we'll now be a bit more overstretched because we now need to ensure that we control the enough of the oil trade to supply the Navy.
Yeah, that's all definitely true. Although, of course, it's worth mentioning that up until about 1904, as a direct result of the Anglo-German naval race, the premier British fleet was the Mediterranean fleet. Yeah, the best ships were in the Mediterranean fleet usually, and the second best ships were in the Channel fleet. And you know, like the top command for a Royal Navy admiral was usually the Mediterranean rather than the Channel. And this oil obviously was going to come through the Suez Canal, which was dominated by Britain because Britain effectively ran Egypt, of course. And also Britain had various colonies and bases and what have you in the Gulf and the Red Sea, like the Trucial States, for example, which you will know about, Hitman. So like places like Dubai, etc., where the Royal Navy still has a naval base. They were British in the early 20th century, you know, or British controlled anyway. So bringing stuff through the Mediterranean was not such a big deal for Britain because Britain basically controlled the Mediterranean in terms of sea power, because of course the Suez Canal was British, Cyprus was British, Malta was British in the middle of the Mediterranean, and obviously the exit to the Atlantic from the Mediterranean, Gibraltar, was also British. So yeah.
Then, of course, the move to secure the oil of the Middle East is also one of the reasons that Britain carves up the Ottoman Empire and creates a series of mandates so it can create a network of pipelines through Iran, through Iraq, and then over to the Mediterranean.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And Britain, of course, had been involved in Iran from the middle of the 19th century. I mean, Britain fought a war against Persia, as it then was, in 1856, I think.
Well, I mean, Britain had contacts with Iran as early as the 17th century. I talked about this in my stream last week, but British officer Robert Shirley helped train the Shah's army in the early 17th century, and that army would go on to give the Ottomans a good thrashing. So
cool. I see people are talking about naval engagements in the First World War around the world. Yes, there were. And I'm going to do a stream at some stage, Lord Charles Thomas, on Coronel and the Falkland Islands battles in 1914, and how Coronel was mostly Winston Churchill's fuck up, but you know, whatever. We will get back to that. But we did it. Lord Charles Thomas, I noticed you were earlier saying the Germans didn't switch to turbines as quickly as the Brits. That's true, and we did actually mention that earlier in the stream. But yeah, could you tell us, Hitman, because I don't know, I know this is your area of expertise. When did British Petroleum come about?
Right. So obviously Anglo-Persian is established in 1909. It renamed itself to Anglo-Iranian oil because that's when Reza Shah requests that all foreign countries refer to the country as Iran and not Persia. So it changed things to Anglo-Iranian in respect of that. And then after all of the whole Operation Ajax, the 1953 coup that removes Mossadegh after he had nationalised the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the company renames itself to British Petroleum. And then BP merged with the American oil giant Amoco, and it's now BP Amoco.
Okay. I thought you'd know about that because this sort of stuff is not my field, But yeah, I do. But going over to oil firing just gave the Royal Navy an even bigger advantage over the German Navy, basically. And as it was difficult for Germany to get oil. This is a totally tangent subject, but in World War II, like a lot of what happened in World War II was Germany trying to get oil, basically, particularly the attack on Russia, the Soviet Union in those days. The German attack on the Soviet Union, as far as Hitler was concerned, was partly to try and get oil, and the Stalingrad offensive that ended in the disaster of Stalingrad wasn't aimed really at Stalingrad. It was aimed at getting down to Baku to get the Soviet oil there, as I'm sure Hitman knows.
Well, I've talked to Ranging Mandel about this before, but probably a more effective strategy would have been to secure the Mediterranean first, so Malta, Cyprus, etc., and then send more troops into North Africa, defeat the British in Egypt, and then you've got the Suez Canal. Then you could just march, into Iraq and into Iran, and you link up because the Shah had friendly relations with the Germans, so they could have just got the oil that way.
Well, yeah, but then you on top of that, you've got to look at Moustache Man's. Had always been talking about Lebensraum in the east and attacking the Soviets, and he didn't like the commies, in which he was entirely correct, of course. But so there was all that on top of it. But if you look at the 1942 German offensive, and in fact, if you look at the 1941 German offensive, like Hitler wasn't particularly interested in taking Moscow. And I still wonder that had the Germans managed to take Moscow in 1941, I'm by no means sure that would have led to Russia's surrender, to the Soviet surrender. I mean, it didn't when Napoleon took it, so why would it if Hitler had taken it,
I mean, perhaps Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad, then possibly, maybe, but just Moscow.
Oh, if he'd have taken all of them, yeah, but the German army simply wasn't strong enough to do that. But in 1942, when he launches Operation Blue, his main aim is the oil fields in Baku. And in fact, AH turned around and said, if I don't get the oil fields in Baku, the war is lost. And he wasn't wrong in that regard. I mean, they did capture one or two of the smaller oil fields, but the Soviets had almost totally destroyed them. And it took the Germans a long time to even start to get them back online. And no sooner had they done this than the Soviet offensives forced the Germans to abandon the area.
And well, it's also interesting because
sorry, carry on. No, you carry on.
It was interesting, ING though, is that half of all the oil consumed by the Germans was actually made domestically through synthetic oil, especially companies like IG Farben. So the Germans actually were able to create a lot of it themselves, even without relying on trading it with various allies or territories.
And most came from Romania, didn't it? I think most of their oil came from Romania, I think.
Well, most of what they imported, yeah, but no, the single most source was actually domestic synthetic oil through IG Farben, which is interesting because it'd be interesting if they'd invested even more in that. Maybe that could have kept them going, but yeah, that's the site in Romania, Ploesti.
Yeah. Yeah, and when the Germans actually fought one of their last big offensives to try and hang on to that in 1940, late 44, and the German army in 44 and 45 just got shorter and shorter of oil all the time, which of course didn't apply to the Soviets because they had Baku and all these other places. And it certainly didn't apply to the British and Americans because the Americans produced actually more oil than anyone else in World War II. And the Brits had all the Middle Eastern oil, pretty much.
Well, I think the Americans produced more oil than the Soviets.
Yeah, I think the Americans produced more than the Middle East did in those days.
Yeah, at that time, but then obviously post-war, because around that time during the war is when the Saudis first reach out to the Americans, and you've got the first discoveries of the Saudi oil. So America was at that time, but very shortly afterwards, the Middle East would suddenly become the leading oil area of the world.
Absolutely correct. Anyway, to get us back to our core subject here, by 1912, the Germans actually, and it was the German foreign minister, I believe, although I'll listen to Aaron and Mitch on this one, but I think it was the German foreign minister who just said, look, the German Navy can't outbuild the Royal Navy. It's not possible. The German army was also starting to get fed up with how much money was being spent on the Navy. And of course, you know, the German army was as vital to Germany as the Royal Navy was to Britain. Germany had Russia on one side and France on the other, and you know, without an army, they were pretty much stuffed. In the same way that Britain depended on the Royal Navy for the security of the British Islands and also the Empire. So as soon as the Navy started to become too expensive, the German General Staff said to the Kaiser, no, we just can't keep this up. There's no point to it.
Yeah, well, the thing was, like, back in the 1890s, I believe there was Tirpitz came up with what was called the Inschrift number 9, which basically said that the German Navy must be a third stronger than either the French Atlantic Fleet or the Russian Baltic Fleet. So by the time war broke out in 1914, the Germans had like 17 dreadnoughts, which was more than all the non-British navies combined.
Yes.
So
yeah,
and
the High Seas Fleet was very much the second biggest navy in the world. Like if Germany had gone to war with the United States, for example, providing Britain stayed neutral, the German Navy could have dominated the east coast of America if it had wanted to, for sure.
Yeah, and the thing was, but I mean, to be fair though, the Germans might have admitted the war, like naval arms race was over, but they had to get over like a sunk cost fallacy kind of moment, because there was a point where the Germans just didn't stop building the ships because it was just like, well, there's too many. Like, for example, the Naval League, which is like similar to the Naval League you mentioned earlier, so much on the ground pressure that's funded by a lot of industrialists at Krupp wanting more ships because it was good for profit. Like it was good for some of the industrialists, but also there was a keen sense of, well, quite a few German students, like young Germans, would have seen us as a rival, and they wanted to humble us. Like, you know, perhaps like you have some Germans comparing Britain to Carthage and Germany to Rome. So that was kind of like the atmosphere for that time among Germans, a lot of them anyway.
Well, look, if you look at naval strengths, and as I say, by 1912, the Germans had like admitted, no, we can't outbuild Britain. It's just not possible. And if you look at naval strengths in 1914, in terms of dreadnoughts, Britain had 29, Germany had 17. So, you know, Germany had been decisively outbuilt. After that, France had 10, and they weren't very good, to be honest with you. And Russia had 4. And I think in 1914, the US had about 12, maybe maybe 14, but I think it was 12. So that's where you get your naval strengths in 1914. As I say, Britain had totally outbuilt the Germans. We had 29 dreadnoughts by this stage, as well as, of course, as the 50 pre-dreadnoughts that we'd had before we started building dreadnoughts. And that's to say nothing about cruisers and destroyers and what have you. And Britain had far more cruisers than Germany, for example. Like Germany, in order to build as many dreadnoughts as she did, had to neglect her cruisers. So when you come to the Battle of Jutland, Britain had something like 40 cruisers and Germany took about 15 or something like that. And they were all light cruisers as well. So basically, Germany totally lost this building race. And her strategy, such as it was in World War I, was to try and pick off bits of the Royal Navy, because that was the only strategy she could actually do. That was the only strategy she could do. And the other thing that Britain had done was, if you look at the map on the screen, which is the North Sea, Germany, as you can see, has a tiny little bit of North Sea coast, and the rest of her fleet is in the Baltic. Now, yes, they built the Kiel Canal, which enabled them to go from the Baltic to the North Sea, but you will notice that if the German fleet is going to go anywhere, or any German ship is going to go anywhere outside of the Baltic, it kind of has to get past the British Isles. And it's certainly not going to go through the Channel. And the only place it can go is north. So the British put their main naval base at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, which you can see on the map. And basically, Britain dominated the North Sea. And the German fleet would occasionally come out, and the Royal Navy would go and fight such bits of it as it found. And the only real enormous clash of the two big fleets was at Jutland in 1916. And the Germans were so short of ships that they actually agreed to allow a pre-dreadnought squadron to accompany the High Seas Fleet. And that meant that the High Seas Fleet's maximum speed was 18 knots, whereas the Royal Navy were going at least 21 knots. The British battle cruiser force under Admiral Beatty was ineptly led. Beatty was not a good fighting admiral. He didn't understand naval gunnery, modern naval gunnery, which the British led the world in, by the way, in the First World War. He had an awful flag officer, as Lord Charles Thomas says in the chat, who couldn't send sensible signals. And basically the German scouting group, which was their battle cruisers, and battle cruisers, for anyone who doesn't get it, were as big as battleships. They were as heavily armed as battleships, but they tended to have slightly thinner armor and were a bit faster. But anyway, Beatty was incompetent, basically, as an admiral, and his flag officer was worse. And the German battle cruisers defeated the British battle cruisers. But fortunately for Beatty, he had the 5th Battle Squadron with him, which were the fast 25-knot Queen Elizabeth battleships, including Queen Elizabeth, War Spy, and like some of the most famous battleships ever built. And these ships, when they eventually managed to catch up with Beatty because of his bad signaling, were able to, they were accurate firing ships. And they were able to start hitting the battle cruisers quite badly. And the British commander, Admiral Jellicoe, who was an excellent naval officer and a gunnery expert, managed to deploy the Grand Fleet so that it crossed the T of the German High Seas Fleet. And so the Germans are steaming, trying to chase the British battle cruisers. And all of a sudden, the whole horizon opened up in gunfire. And it was the Grand Fleet. And the German Admiral Scheer and Hipper, the German Admiral Scheer and Hipper understood immediately that what they were looking at was death, basically. They couldn't fight the Grand Fleet. They didn't have enough warships. And so they did an emergency thing that the Germans had practiced because they knew they didn't have enough ships to fight the Grand Fleet, called a battle turn away, which basically meant every ship turned around on its own length and reversed the order of the fleet. And it was a way to run away really quickly. And the Germans did this, getting hit as they did. Then they tried to go forward again because the Germans are in a trap at this stage. And this battle, the Germans called it the Skagerrak, which you can see on the map there between Denmark and Norway, between Denmark and Oslo. And it was that area where this battle is fought. And the Germans turned around and they tried to go forward again, and they ran into the Grand Fleet again. Just the whole horizon, as far as you could see with a pair of field glasses, pair of binoculars, was just British battleships opening fire on the Germans again. And again, the Germans did their battle turn away, which was as I said, it was something the Germans practiced, and it was a way of running away, basically. And they did this again. And unfortunately, the one thing the Royal Navy had neglected a bit before World War I was night fighting. And also giving subordinate commanders the ability to ignore admirals and send messages and so on. And the Germans, very luckily for them, managed to fight their way through the British light cruisers and destroyers during the night with some losses and got back to port. And all the intelligent German seamen, all the intelligent German naval guys, from the admirals down to the more intelligent of the seamen, realized that the German Navy had had the luckiest escape they could possibly have. And the German Navy, the Grand Fleet, the Royal Navy Grand Fleet, was ready for battle again within 24 hours of Jutland. Some of the German battle cruisers and battleships took months to repair. They were so badly damaged. And this was despite the fact the British had fairly defective shells at Jutland. Had the British shells worked as they were meant to, the Germans probably would have lost at least 5 or 6 battleships in the action that happened. But the Germans ran away, basically. The Royal Navy retained the position. Went home, were ready for battle 24 hours later. The German High Seas Fleet wasn't ready for action for months because of repairs. And the next time the German High Seas Fleet sailed together as a body was when it sailed across to Scapa Flow to surrender to the Royal Navy in 1918. Although before that, the German sailors actually mutinied. They spent most of the war swinging at anchor in various German ports because they weren't strong enough to go and fight the Royal Navy. And the Kaiser was desperately keen not to have his ship sunk. He didn't like this at all. Very risk averse. So the German sailors' morale got lower and lower and lower. And then in 1918, some German naval officers came up with a cunning plan. And their cunning plan was to sail out on a suicide mission against the Grand Fleet, which by 1918 was even more powerful than it had been in 1916, and even included an American naval battle squadron. They would have been annihilated. So the German sailors, who, as I say, had spent most of the war doing nothing, basically, they mutinied. And it was these guys who started the mutinies that resulted in the German Kaiser abdicating and the German General Staff calling for an armistice to end the war. So you could very strongly argue that the German High Seas Fleet did nothing good for Germany ever. And in fact, was the first thing that made them lose World War I. I don't know what people like Aaron and Mitch and Hitman have to say about that, but that's my view, is that this German High Seas Fleet was a complete disaster for the Germans, basically.
No, it certainly does seem that way. A great big investment that didn't really pay off. And on that point, I do actually need to head off now, Jake. So thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on, mate, and especially your expertise about the Middle East and the oil stuff was most welcome. Thank you.
Oh, that's fine. We'll see you around.
Go on, mate. Oh, damn it. I meant to... listen, I will put Hitman's channel's description in a pinned comment after the stream. Okay? So if you want to follow up on Hitman's channel, which has a lot of interesting stuff, especially about the Middle East, you'll be able to go and check him out that way. Lord Charles Thomas says Dreadnought was not present for the battle. She was actually leading the pre-Dreadnought battleships of the British Channel Fleet at the time, Lord Charles Thomas, and I did actually mention this earlier in the stream. Aaron, what would you say about the politics of the German High Seas Fleet and how useful it was for Germany?
But it wasn't very useful. And I would say it's poisoned the well. So it poisoned the well sort of Anglo-German relations. If, as both me and you, Duke, said already, if this naval race hadn't happened, Britain would not have gotten into its alliance with the Russians and the French, and we probably wouldn't have gotten into an alliance with the Germans. We would have had a sort of good working relationship with them, and this is the thing that sort of turns Britain from relatively neutral, friendly neutral power towards Germany, looking to make Germany a satisfied power, into a geopolitical opponent. And it's entirely because of the German seeming inability to see how the British would react to them building up the Navy and threatening the Royal Navy.
Yeah, totally agree, man. I don't disagree with any of that at all. I think that's true. Mitch, any thoughts?
I was just saying that on one hand, there's a touch of irony in the sense that, the Kaiser's own vanity project was the one thing that was a lot of the first catalyst towards him having to leave Pell, but also I think went back to, because apparently there's a quote from the Second World War that says that Hitler had to deal with a Prussian aristocrat army, a National Socialist Air Force, and a Communist Navy on account of the Navy ever since 1918, because being more predisposed towards leftist ideas, because of course the sailors in 1918, they were hoisting red flags as well as throwing their officers overboard or killing them to avoid.
Yeah, they weren't, as I said, Mitch, they weren't keen on doing a suicide mission against the Grand Fleet, which by that stage was even more powerful than it had been in 1916, when the German High Seas Fleet had a lucky escape, basically.
Yeah, and you can imagine the mistakes that we made in Jutland would not be replicated the second time. And it's like, because it's like similar things were said about the U-boat in World War II. Like, after 1942, especially, U-boat crews would just be really pessimistic. So like, it
Yeah,
was
you
generally
had a
matter of,
very good chance of drowning after 1942, or
yeah,
being in an implosion underwater where your U-boat just imploded.
yeah, and that's. That's more of a problem with the Germans is the fact that they had no chance of winning a war against us long term because so Tirpitz, for example, he was saying, "Oh well, we need supremacy." Or something. Go, yeah, the only chance of that was if they were able to destroy the British home fleet and Channel fleet in chunks at a time, which was never going to happen.
No,
So it
it
was just
was never going to happen. Apart from anything else, we haven't talked about this on this stream, but British intelligence in World War One and in World War Two, for that matter, was actually quite a lot better than the Germans.
yeah. Well, to be fair, in the Second World War, you had Wilhelm Canaris, who was working with allies, I believe. I don't know about the First World War too much in terms of German intelligence, but yeah, it's just a matter of well, yeah. I think Big Surge said it best. Like this was just back, but the Germans engaging with naval arms was the biggest strategic blunder probably you can name in history. Like at least
Yeah,
with
well,
something like
it made Britain their enemy, Mitch. I mean, if they hadn't have built the High Seas Fleet, I'm fairly certain that Britain would have been neutral in World War One.
yeah, because it's like you had some people in Britain before and they were a bit scared about the Germans. Like for example, during the Franco-Prussian War, there was that famous book, The Battle of Dorking, which is all about a prospective invasion by the Germans, which well everyone just saw was well how can the Germans invade us because they don't have a navy. Like so
Exactly.
for example, the Prussians for a time they wanted a navy, but that was because during the Second Schleswig War, even when they were winning battles against the Danish on land, they
The
were still
Danish
getting
Navy was more powerful than the Prussian Navy. Yeah, it was.
yeah, and the Germans at that time they bought a couple of ironclads, one from us and one from the French. Well, the French built one was pretty crap, like it served for all of a few years before the damn thing sank because it was poorly designed. Then the British one, like it didn't really have much of a distinguished service because the Germans about like even in the Franco-Prussian War, they just didn't really do much of their fleet because well, all the fighting was done on land. And to be fair, you know, it was just one of the things where the Germans probably should have just kept to on land. It's like the same with it's like it's like I was mentioning with Romans. I mean, yeah, that's the thing about the Romans. They weren't particularly a naval power. They just had to develop it because of a geopolitical rival. But like
Yeah,
the dynamic, but the Romans were able to adapt. But the Romans, they did it by literally just boarding Carthaginian ships. You can't do that in World War One. Like the German main fleet, like the German main strength, can't be replicated on sea as it was on land, like the Romans could do between land and sea. So, you know, that was,
yeah. I mean, the other thing is look at the map on the screen, and Britain's an island, obviously, and all around that island, certainly prior to 1922, were dockyards that could build battleships. You know, there were dreadnoughts at the Battle of Jutland that were built in the Thames. Scotland had a huge shipbuilding industry. Northern Ireland had a huge shipbuilding industry. There was a lot of shipbuilding on the Humber River. There was a lot of shipbuilding on the Tyne River. You could build ships in Plymouth. Bristol could build ships. And then look at the tiny German coast. And there's just, you can only build ships in some places. And there was no way that Germany could ever hope, no matter how much money they spent, Germany could never hope to build more warships than Britain could. There was no chance whatsoever of it ever happening. And I just feel that if the Germans hadn't have tried to outbuild the Royal Navy and failed, I don't think Britain would have fallen into the arms of her traditional enemies, France and Russia, at all. And, you know, the whole of world history would have been totally different.
Yeah, I'd just like to add something that Mitch brought up about the Dorking. You can sort of see through sort of pulp fiction in Britain, sort of switch in views of Germany, particularly through two books written by a sort of popular novelist called William Le Queux. And he wrote a book called The Great War in England in 1894, which is where the British end up fighting the Russians and the French. And in that, the Germans are an ally. And then in 1906, he writes his more famous book, The Invasion of 1910, where the Germans are the enemy. And this is directly the consequence of the German naval build-up. That Germany goes from being seen as a friendly power in the mid-1890s to an opponent in the mid-Edwardian era.
Absolutely. Yep. Totally true. I'd say there's also, if you look at that era of the 1900s, it was also an era when most of the guys who were talking about the Battle of Dorking and all this nonsense of a German invasion of Britain, they were mostly army people. They weren't naval guys.
Yeah.
Because the naval people knew damn well the Germans couldn't do this. But the army guys were constantly trying to push this shit. And even, look, I'm a fan of Lord Roberts of Kandahar, the guy who eventually won the Anglo-Boer War and all the rest of it. But I think he was completely wrong in terms of his National Service League and all that stuff. I don't support it at all.
Yeah, and actually, you bring up Roberts in the beginning of the book, The Invasion of 1910. The introduction bit is actually an introduction by, I can't remember if it's an introduction or a long quote from Roberts advocating conscription in peacetime. And so that sort of played up during this period as well in the army.
Yeah, and also you also have to remember in the early 1900s, Britain was the British General Staff of the Army, not the Navy, the Army, was already in secret talks with the French to put a British army on the left flank of France because of the entente with France.
Yeah.
So this was a self-reinforcing thing, but it would have been impossible for the British Army to have done this, and also some liberal politicians, it has to be said, including Churchill. It would have been impossible for these people to have done this if Britain had not been scared by the German high seas fleet build-up. You know, if the Germans don't build a great big navy, then none of this stuff happens, in my opinion. Because Britain didn't care about the German army because it was no threat to Britain because they couldn't get across the sea. It's only when the Germans build a big navy that Britain must all of a sudden see Germany as this big potential enemy. If they don't do that, then it doesn't happen. I don't know if either of you guys agree with that or disagree with it.
Oh no, I agree. That's the thing that does it. Every other sort of diplomatic crisis you get from, say, 1907 onwards is a consequence of the German naval race. Particularly, you think of the Moroccan crises in 1911. That is directly because of the German gunboat to Morocco, and then that in turn provokes the Italians to go against the Ottomans in the Italo-Ottoman War to take Libya, which in turn provokes the Balkan powers, seeing the weakness of the Ottomans to provoke the Balkan War, which sees the Balkan League defeat the Ottomans successfully, and then that collapses into a complete chaos over sort of post-First Balkan War division of territory, which provokes the Second Balkan War, which switches in the Balkans the Russians from backing the Bulgarians to backing the Serbians, and that sets up the July crisis in 1940. So it's all, to me, downstream from the naval race.
100%. Yeah, 100%. Like, but I always say that joining World War I in 1914 was the original sin of Britain and the Empire. And then we compounded that by raising a mass army against all British military tradition. But yeah, if you don't have that, then nothing after 1914 happens. And if you don't have the Anglo-German naval race, I'm not sure 1914 happens at all, to be honest. Certainly not in the way it did. So yeah, I think there is a strong case that this was like you could trace a lot of the ills of Britain and of Europe back to the Anglo-German naval race. It was a mistake. It was a mistake. It was a huge mistake from Germany's point of view. You know, it just was. Because if you don't have 1914-18, the war, in the way it turns out, then, you know, presumably the Hohenzollerns stay in charge of Germany. You never get the rise of AH and all the rest of it, you know. So the whole history of the 20th century would have changed. So that's why I think it's quite important, and why I've spoken about it a few times now. But I don't think you can overemphasize how important the Anglo-German naval race from 1900-ish onwards was to the history of the world, and what a bad effect it had. And it wasn't, I'll be honest, you know, I'm quite happy to say when Britain does bad things, but the Anglo-German naval race was caused by the Germans. It wasn't caused by the Brits. You know, Britain wasn't interested in having an army that could rival Prussia and Germany, but she had to have the Premier Navy because she was an island nation that had a worldwide empire, and without a navy, she couldn't keep that empire. So any threat to that was going to mean Britain was going to become your enemy, and that was Germany's fault. It wasn't Britain's. You know, Britain was entirely neutral in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Britain didn't really care that the Prussians and the Germans overran France. You know, France was not Britain's friend. Far from it. She'd been our main enemy for 200 years and longer. So yeah, I just think the Anglo-German naval race was really the root cause of many of the worst things that came out of the 20th century that we are still living with today. So yeah, I would at some stage like to do a follow-up stream to this about the 1922 Washington Naval Conference, where Britain voluntarily gave up naval dominance made the British Empire dependent on an American goodwill, which was never there in their government. You know, the Americans never had a great deal of goodwill to the British Empire. Never did. Not from their formation, for obvious reasons, if you look at it. So, Duke Valentino in the chat keeps going on about U-boats. This is not a stream about U-boats, mate, all right? U-boats were what Germany resorted to when a navy couldn't do anything. And yes, they caused the Royal Navy quite a lot of damage, until the Royal Navy brought in convoys. And as soon as they did, U-boats weren't effective anymore. And the other thing U-boats did was they brought the Americans into the war by sinking American ships. So, unrestricted U-boat warfare, whereby they just sank anything, including like any merchant ship, passenger ship, didn't matter. They just sank it. That was a disaster too. Again, German naval policy in World War One was a disaster for Germany in every respect. Germany would have been much, much better off in World War One if it didn't have a navy at all, really, in my opinion. But anyway, any final words, Mitch or Aaron?
Someone saying the Americans were great. I mean, we could have dealt with the Americans if we didn't do a retardation of signing the Washington Treaty and having Mr.
Yes.
saying Yankophilia that has always pervaded since then. With the Germans, it's just the fact they're geographically closer to us, so that's why they were seen as a greater threat than the Americans. Plus the Japanese alliance meant that if the Americans had any ideas, they would have to, let's say for argument's sake, the Americans were to try anything with us. Well, the Anglo-Japanese alliance means that they've got to be like, the Roman god Janus have to have have to have one face towards the Atlantic and one face towards the Pacific. And
they have totally agree. Yeah, look, I totally agree, Mitch. And if we do the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty stream, that's one we'll talk about that. I mean, one of the things the Americans demanded of Britain was that we got rid of the Anglo-Japanese alliance.
Yeah,
but Britain should have just said no, basically. Go to war if you want, because
Well, this is the thing. I don't particularly like studying this part of it just to be painful. I just look at this part here and just go, I can feel a sense of just disappointment, to say the least. And that's putting it mildly. I'm just looking at this part of history and I go, we willingly stabbed ourselves to death, and for what? To appease a power that was anti-Britain to begin with, anyway.
Yep, totally agree. Look, to my mind, after Britain supposedly won World War One, right, which I don't think we should have been in the first place, and certainly not in 1914, and certainly not with a mass army that gave us 1 million dead during the war, the whole empire, I mean. Then we have the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, at which stage Britain has something like 33 dreadnoughts and the Americans have about 18. And we just say, all right, we'll scrap all our ships, so we only have 15 like you. It's insanity. It's insanity. It just is. It's insanity, in my opinion. It was like it was the British Empire committing suicide, basically. And we only saw that actual suicide during World War II. Like 15, 16 years later. But you can trace all of this shit back to the Anglo-German naval race. No Anglo-German naval race. Britain doesn't become an ally of France and Russia. World War One probably doesn't happen even. And if it does, it's a European land war and it doesn't last long, relatively. Because Germany's going to win by 1915 or 16. And it's going to do probably pretty much what it did in 1870. It's going to nick a few little border areas of France, and it's going to charge the French an enormous amount of money again. And why does that affect Britain? It doesn't, basically. Not at all. And Britain remains the richest nation in the world. And it just makes history so different, Aaron, anything, or Mitch, anything, guys?
Just one thing. Duke Valentino had a question in the chat. What role did Churchill play during this period before the war? He was First Order Admiralty from 1911 to 1914, and so he is, when he's there during the final stage of the naval race, he is very much supporting the Royal Navy's position and very much supporting the Royal Navy build-up. In fact, in 1913, he threatens to resign when the cabinet opposes building more dreadnoughts. His role before the First World War, before he gets appointed to the Admiralty in October 1911, is not particularly influential necessarily on foreign policy. He's in the Home Office and he's at the Board of Trade and he's at the Colonial Office as a junior minister. And the person who is really important in this period when it comes to British foreign policy and Anglo-German relations is the Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, who, when he gets appointed in 1906, and remains in the role until sort of early into World War One, he's effectively independent. He's operating independently from the government. And both the Prime Ministers, Campbell Bannerman and Asquith, are willing to let him have free rein to the extent that the Foreign Office is referred to in the period as the independent kingdom of the Foreign Office.
Yeah, and it was Grey who led us into these. They were probably worse than alliances in many respects, because like Germany's sitting there thinking, well, will Britain join World War One? But Grey had effectively committed Britain to joining World War One years before 1914.
Yeah, and when the cabinet is discussing the idea of going to war, he threatens if Britain doesn't support the French, he will resign. And if he had resigned, that would have brought down the government, because he was so crucial to Asquith's cabinet and Asquith's government that Asquith this sort of reinforces Asquith's support for him. He and Asquith are good friends and close political allies, but this sort of even further reinforces that. So he is the man, to my mind, he's the man who gets Britain into the war.
Yep.
Not
my favourite guy by a long way. A million British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand dead in World War One, down to that man, if you ask me. Also the destruction of British power and wealth that resulted from World War One for no good reason, and just simply led directly to World War II in many respects. But again, all traceable back to the Anglo-German naval race from about 1900. And that was the Germans who did that. It wasn't the British. Yeah. Britain didn't want a naval race with anyone. We just wanted to sit as the superior naval power in the world, which we needed to be as an island state and an empire that encompassed the globe. So, Britain had to have a powerful navy in the same way that Germany had to have a powerful army.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mitch, any final thoughts, mate?
Someone that's going to be Kriegsmarine in World War II. Eric Leider, I know, he was wanting Plan Z or Plan Z, however you pronounce it.
Which was even more impossible than the High Seas Fleet, because the German infrastructure in the 30s and 40s was even lower than under the Kaiser in terms of building warships.
Yeah,
the Germans were taking. The Germans in World War II built 4 battleships. They built Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, Bismarck and Tirpitz, all of which eventually got sunk by the Brits, basically. But
yeah, it's like Norway, for example. There's so many capital ships on the side of the Germans were lost just in Norway alone. But there was no prospect of. You have the U-boats, which I think it's something like. Dönitz was very much of a submarine guy, because he believed more in men. But even so, it was just a matter of, well, most in the Navy weren't really optimistic about the chances going up against the Royal Navy. Like you have Hitler who wanted more U-boats built, but of course, like if you and Dönitz was largely a more, I won't say full on like party loyalist. I think like that's a bit overplayed on some people's part, but let's just say he'll do his duty as told by the Führer, and he went along with it, even though plenty of the Kriegsmarine were just like, well, look, especially after 1942, there was no prospects of the U-boats bringing us to surrender.
No.
But it was just like,
By the middle of 1942, the U-boats were an ever decreasing threat, and being a German U-boat officer or crew was a good way to die, basically.
Yeah, because you go back, because it's like because you have sonar, then you've got so many other technological advancements in our part, which just mean basically there's no prospect of the Germans winning. That's why it's simple. It was just a matter of, well, the Germans had no other ideas, so they just invested a lot more into U-boats, but there's some cost fallacy, like with the German arms race after a time.
Yeah. Vex Peril, if you don't like this channel, you are very welcome to fuck off and not watch it, mate. I don't care if you watch it or not, mate. Really don't. Go away. Anyway, sorry. I don't mean to be rude, but I just watch people talking crap in the chat, How black was the black pudding? Well, black pudding's made from blood, so it's probably blood red, mate, but there you go. How many ships did the U-boat sink in World War II? Asked Duke Valentino. A great many, until in 1917, the Royal Navy brought in convoys. And once they brought in convoys, all of the U-boat sinkings dropped off enormously. Vexed Peril, you know what you're here for? Yeah? Do you know what you're here for? You're here to be banned. See you later, mate. That's the end of Vexed Peril. Anyway, I don't mind. People can disagree with me or my guests as much as they like. But if you want to be really rude, then at the end of the day, you can fuck off. So there you go. Look, we're giving our opinions. You can disagree if you want. But if you're just going to like swear and act like some twat, sorry, I'll ban you. But anyway. Thank you very much to my guest this evening, Hitman. And Hitman has an excellent channel on YouTube, which is called Hitman. And there will be links to that under the stream later on. Anything you'd like to plug, Mitch? All right, I think Mitch is gone. I don't think Mitch has a YouTube channel at the moment, but anyway. Aaron, would you like to plug your channel, mate?
Yes, I will. Thank you. My channel is at Aaron James Hook, where I review mainly books, but also do film reviews and sometimes TV stuff. I'm going to be doing a live stream on Friday at 7 p.m. To discuss the results of the English local elections and the Runcorn Hillsby by-election. That will go on for about an hour. Duke, I think you might be on as a guest.
Yeah, I'll try, mate. I've committed to 2 streams this week, not on my channel. I'm going to be on Tim Wilms's stream for the Australian elections and also yours, but providing I can do them, okay?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, I should say that if any of the mutuals from the Discord are watching, if you want to come on a guest to that stream, you're more than welcome. Just let you know. And also, sort of a bit of an announcement for something we'll be doing in June, me and Duke. I'm going to be reading my way through a couple of the Aubrey and Maturin novels by Patrick O'Brien, which is Duke's favourite book series. and Patrick O'Brien is his favourite novelist, I believe, Duke, and I'll be reading them ready for a live stream me and Duke will be doing on the book series itself sometime in June. I don't know exactly when, but it's most likely to be sometime mid-June, possibly.
Yeah, look, Aaron's got a very much a literary review channel, and I actually said to Aaron that the Aubrey Maturin books are my favourite historical novels. So yeah, I will happily do that. If you haven't read Patrick O'Brien's Aubrey Maturin books, which the really excellent film Master and Commander is based on, you are missing out. Go and check those books out. They're the best books about the Navy of the Royal Navy of the Nelson era that are out there. So yeah, I look forward to that, Aaron. Thank you.
Okay.
Mitch, I did ask you if you had anything to plug. I presume you don't, because you dropped off. But all right. Okay, guys, I'm going to play us out with an appropriate tune, I hope. Where are we? Yeah, I'll get there. Right, there we go. That should work. Okay, that was Under the White Ensign, and that's a tune from the excellent channel Patriotic Archive, which I can thoroughly recommend. He's a good friend of the channel and a member of my Discord and a good bloke, so go and check his channel out. And the thumbnail there was, I think it was HMS Renown, a battle cruiser from the First World War with a Royal Navy sentry somewhere in the Mediterranean in the 1930s. Thank you very much to my guests this evening, Mitch, Hitman, and Aaron Hook. DLs for Hitman and Aaron Hook's channel will be under the stream later on. Do go and check those out. Let me just check entropy, as I always do before I close. Okay, I can't see anything on there, guys. So if anyone sent us a chat, let me know and I'll check it out, but I can't see one at the moment. All right, guys. Thank you very much to my guests again. Go well. We will be back on Saturday, British time, early Sunday morning, for our normal Splendid Isolation stream, looking at current events and politics and the sad fate of Canada and what have you. So go well and don't let the bastards grind you down. Go well, people.